Hello and welcome once again to Pumping Numbers. Today, the 5 top old school video game consoles of the 70s and 80s. That's right, the 8-bit to 16-bit phenomenons that changed a generation. 5. How many people remember this one? The Magnavox Odyssey II. The 2 was a sequel to the original Odyssey, the second video game console after the brown box of 1967. The original Odyssey didn't have cartridges. It had printed circuit boards. Needless to say, the sequel was a huge step up. Released in late 1978 and costing $179, the Odyssey II CPU unit was an 8-bit microcontroller running at 1.79 MHz, and its audio-video RAM 128 bytes. But for its time, the Odyssey II was pretty innovative. It had a speech synthesis unit. It allowed gamers to hear speech, music, and sound effects in ways they hadn't heard previously from a game system. Odyssey even released a cartridge called Computer Intro that was designed to teach simple computer programming via an alphanumeric keyboard. The Odyssey was also the first to fuse board games with video games, as they did with Quest for the Rings. In all, close to 50 games were released in the United States, such as Cosmic Conflict, Smithereens, and Alien Invaders. Odyssey sold 2 million units before it got bum-rushed by the Atari 2600. 4. No, that's not a cell phone from the 1980s. That is a controller from ColecoVision. Yes, in August of 1982, ColecoVision hit US homes. With 16 kilobytes of video RAM, ColecoVision was the first video game console to boast isometric graphics, as seen in the memorable video game Zaxxon. It retailed for $199 when first released, which would just about be $486 in today's money. 500,000 units were sold that Christmas, and by introducing Nintendo's classic video game Donkey Kong, millions more units would be sold. ColecoVision would boast some interesting accessories as well, such as a trackball, a steering wheel, and Atom, that turned the ColecoVision into a computer with a keyboard, a printer, and a cassette drive. ColecoVision even sold an expansion module that allowed you to play Atari 2600 games. That didn't make Atari feel too good, but there was little they could do about it, since their parts were never exclusive. ColecoVision ended its run in 1985, another victim of the 1983 video game crash. 3. Intellivision. You remember this. Intellivision was released in 1980 and was the first video game console to give the Atari 2600 a run for its money. Well, at first anyway. Although it was the first 16-bit video game console and boasted 1,456 bytes of RAM, the price tag was $299. Eventually, Intellivision did find their stride. They sold 175,000 consoles that year, and their library grew to 35 games. Within 2 years, over 2 million consoles were sold, and seeing the potential, Atari game developers such as Magic and Activision began releasing games for Intellivision. However, like most of the game consoles of the day, Intellivision would hit a dead end due to the video game crash of 1983. Intellivision was ahead of its time in several areas. They made downloadable games possible via cable TV, featured a controller that allowed 16 directions, and was the first to incorporate real human voices in the middle of a game. Standard now, not so much back in the early 80s. 2. 1977 gave us the Apple II computer, Star Wars, and the Atari 2600. A revolution in video gaming. Originally called the VCS, or Video Computer System, the 2600 had a maximum resolution of 160 by 192 pixels. You could play games with the trademark joystick, paddles, driving controller, trackball, and even a keypad. The 2600 would come in a variety of models over the years, including the original 6-switch model, the 4-switch model, and the all-black model that was nicknamed Darth Vader. The introductory price would set you back $199 in 1978, and despite the hype, the Atari 2600 didn't catch on as well as you might have thought, at least not initially. It only sold 550,000 units from a production run of 800,000, and that was likely due to the fact that people weren't aware that Atari had games other than Pong. Atari would release 9 launch titles, including Indy 500, Starship, and Street Racer. By Christmas 1979, there was no stopping this train. Atari would sell over 1 million units. And then the following year, something even bigger happened. They got the opportunity to license the arcade hit Space Invaders, adding another 2 million units sold. By 1982, sales reached $4 billion. The big reason? Just a yellow monster smiley face that eats dots and ghosts. In fact, Pac-Man was so widely popular, it ended up selling 3/4 of what Atari itself was selling. The Atari 2600 would spawn countless clones in the ensuing years, but accept no substitutes. There's only one. Oh, you know that sound. On October 18th, 1985, a great thing happened. A marvelous thing happened. The Nintendo Entertainment System made its way to America. The deluxe set gave you Rob, a light gun called the NES Zapper, 2 controllers, and 2 game packs, Gyromat and Duck Hunt. Rob didn't last too long, but it was fun to play with. The NES contained 2 kilobytes of onboard work RAM. Game cartridges often contained expanded RAM to increase this amount, such as Galaxian and Metal Slayer Glory. Nintendo launched a very aggressive marketing campaign. 17 launch titles were released, including, of course, the big one, Super Mario Bros. Nintendo reignited interest in the video game market after the crash of 1983, in large part because there was no confusion between versions of different games. Whereas Pac-Man could look different between Atari and ColecoVision, with Super Mario Bros., what you saw on the NES was only on the NES. Graphics were never exaggerated on the packaging. Nintendo also restricted developers from publishing and distributing without Nintendo's approval. This led to higher quality games due to exclusivity, something that was not apparent during the crash. That didn't mean that Nintendo didn't welcome third-party developers. It did mean that they had the strictest licensing rules of the day. Over 60 million units were sold worldwide, making it the biggest selling video game system of the era. By 1990, 30% of American households owned the NES. There you have it, the top video game consoles of the 70s and 80s.